In 1902, English author W. Jacobs published a horror short story entitled The Monkey's Paw. It tells the tale of a British couple and their grown son as they're visited by an old friend who gives them a mummified monkey's paw. The paw is supposedly bewitched, but the family is skeptical. Believing the paw to be a sham, the husband wishes for $200 to pay the home's mortgage. The next day, the couple receives terrible news. Their son has been killed at work, and while the company he works for refuses to take responsibility for it, they do agree to pay a small sum to the bereaved. $200 to be exact. A little while after this, the husband, in his grief, wishes that their son would come back to life. Later that night, there's a knock at the door, which the wife gets up to answer. Meanwhile, the husband, in fear that something evil is at the door, scrambles to find the paw and makes his final wish. When the wife opens the door, there's nobody there at all. This ending is meant to be a bit ambiguous, but the message of the story is still clear. Be careful what you wish for. Since its publication, the story of the monkey's paw has been used time and time again as a classic example of getting more or less than you bargained for. It's a symbol of making a trade-off with unforeseen circumstances. It's no wonder then that this story is so popular because of this. Bargains with unforeseen consequences can be seen everywhere throughout history and in daily life. There's never a moment in which someone or something isn't swindling or being swindled. Of all these ill-fated trade-offs, though, the most interesting, in my opinion, are those we see in nature. Evolution itself is constantly making these trade-offs in order to allow a creature to be the best fit it can be for its environment, even if that benefit is only short-term in the end. With that in mind, this intro is getting a bit long, so without further ado, let's start at the beginning. What causes sickle disease? Well, it's not contagious like a virus or bacteria, but it can spread from person to person under specific conditions. These conditions I'm referring to are simply inheritance, being born. Sickle cell disease is a hereditary condition. Now you may be asking, how does that work? Well, I like to think of it like this. Let's say you're making a smoothie and, for some reason, you decided to use only apples and bananas. Chances are, when you blend that smoothie up and take a drink, all you're going to taste is banana. In genetics, this is what we call complete dominance. It's where the presence of just one dominant type gene causes the other non-dominant genes, which are referred to as recessive, to be overpowered and completely masked. Now, sickle cell disease is a recessive gene, which means that in order for there to even be a chance that it will be inherited, both parents must possess at least one iteration of the recessive gene. This can be visually illustrated like this. See these big letters? Those represent dominant non-sickle cell blood genes. These little letters are the sickle cell genes. In this diagram, the offspring of these two parents only has a quarter chance of inheriting sickle cell disease. Additionally, we can see that because both parents possess one of those uppercase dominant genes, they both do not have sickle cell disease themselves. This, however, does not mean their blood is without anomalous properties. We'll touch on that later, though. So, now that we know where sickle cell disease comes from, let's look at As you may have guessed, the main symptom of sickle cell disease is described in its name. The disease causes a disorder in the structure of red blood cells which leads to a twisted, oblong shape that sort of resembles a sickle. This may not seem like a huge problem at a glance, but in the world of human anatomy where every mechanism is finely tuned for a specific job, small details like the shape of a cell are vital. So, what's the big deal about these misshapen cells? Well, they cause two big problems. The first issue caused by this irregular shape is related to the function of red blood cells. Normally, red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen throughout the body. They do this using a protein called hemoglobin that's synthesized inside the red blood cells. With hemoglobin, the cells are able to create temporary bonds with oxygen that allow them to carry it anywhere in the body. In sickle-shaped cells, this hemoglobin is greatly altered. In fact, the underlying cause of the sickle shape in diseased cells is this mutated hemoglobin. This mutation results in sickle-shaped cells being less capable of carrying oxygen. This means that many of the sickle cells are incapable of carrying enough oxygen to keep the body running effectively. This issue is exacerbated by the second major problem caused by sickle cell disease, which is related to the very structure of the diseased cells. Normal red blood cells are round in shape and possess a certain amount of elasticity and gumminess because of this. This allows the cells to flow easily through the many arteries and blood vessels of the body. Sickle-shaped cells, on the other hand, lack this elasticity and are much more rigid and oblong in shape. This causes them to pile up within passageways and block any healthy blood cells from reaching their destination. The combination of these blockages and the fact that many sickle cells that do get past will not be carrying a sufficient amount of blood means that people who suffer from sickle cell disease also experience anemia, hence the disease's more common name, sickle cell anemia. Speaking of symptoms, there are many symptoms and complications associated with the abnormal shape of cells affected by sickle cell disease. I probably can't cover every single one in this video, but I have compiled some of the most common and most severe in order to illustrate what it might be like to live with sickle cell disease. One more common event caused by sickle cell disease is what's called a sickle cell crisis. This is caused by a buildup of sickle-shaped cells in blood vessels, causing a complete blockage. These blockages, which can cause immense pain, most often occur in the chest, arms, and legs. Additionally, if the blockage is severe enough, it can also lead to tissue death as a result of the absence of a good blood supply. Another common symptom of sickle cell disease that often appears in the first few years of an individual's life is pain and swelling in the hands or feet. This swelling may also be accompanied by fatigue brought on by anemia. Together, these symptoms are often the first indicator for doctors that a child may have sickle cell anemia. How do they make sure, though? We'll get to that in a second. In the meantime, think back to the beginning of this video. Remember the story I opened with, The Monkey's Paw? A tale meant to exemplify a bargain gone wrong. Well, believe it or not, that did have some relevance to today's subject. Why? Well, because there's something I haven't told you about sickle cell disease. Something that makes it seem a little less like a disease and more like an evolutionary trade-off. A bargain gone wrong, if you will. Sickle cell disease fights malaria. Well, fight isn't the right word. Sickle cell disease is more comparable to a defense mechanism, a resistance. The cause of this resistance that it provides can once again be traced back to the abnormal shape of diseased cells. See, malaria is a blood-borne disease that uses red blood cells to reproduce rapidly. It nests itself inside the cell and multiplies asexually until the blood cell itself pops like a balloon, releasing the many copies of malaria to infect other red blood cells and repeat the process. As you can imagine, this method of infection is extremely effective and very hard to prevent internally once it's begun. All that being said, though, evolution did manage to find a crafty solution. See, the shape of sickle cells isn't just good for blocking blood flow, it also just happens to be irregular and rigid enough to completely prevent malaria from entering or reproducing within the irregularly shaped cells. This is huge because it essentially makes sickle cell disease an evolutionary counter to malaria. This is reflected in the evolutionary history of sickle cell disease. As you can see, the area where malaria is historically endemic also happens to be the same areas where sickle cell disease seems to have emerged. An important detail to note here is that all of these areas largely contain people of color, which is why today we see sickle cell disease affecting and being passed on by almost exclusively people of color. While we're on the subject of passing things on, remember those two sections in our Punnett square earlier, the ones with the mismatched letters? And the parents, who also had mismatched letters. Well, as you may have suspected, the normal rules of dominance don't quite apply here. This is what's called genetic codominance. When genes are codominant, they're both able to express themselves, at least partially, without one being completely dominant over the other. This can be seen in people with wavy hair, which is caused by a codominant relationship between a straight hair gene and a curly hair gene. In the case of sickle cell disease, when someone only has one of the recessive sickle cell genes, their body is still able to produce a satisfactory amount of normally shaped red blood cells. However, it does still make some sickle-shaped cells too. This condition is called sickle cell trait, and it serves as a sort of evolutionary fix for the issues seen in fully fledged sickle cell disease. While individuals with sickle cell trait still have some irregularly shaped cells, they are generally less likely to experience anemia. Additionally, they're unlikely to experience any sickle crises at all. Despite the reduction in the amount of sickle-shaped cells present in individuals who only have sickle cell trait, it still seems that they exhibit a very high resistance to malaria. I wasn't able to find any sources comparing the resistance of someone with full sickle cell disease to someone who only possesses the trait. However, there is significant research to show that people who have sickle cell trait clear malaria much faster than those who do not. This, I suspect, is the reason that sickle cell genes have survived in humans for so long. While having sickle cell disease may cause significant drawbacks, having a few sickle-shaped cells in your bloodstream can actually serve as a powerful deterrent against malaria. Alright, that was a lot. This video is very close to being over, I promise, but there is one last question left unanswered. How do we detect and diagnose sickle cell disease? Sickle cell disease testing can occur before a baby is even born. Parents are often asked if they or any other family members have had issues related to irregular blood. Additionally, genetic tests can be performed by taking samples of a fetus's blood or amniotic fluid. After birth, babies are often subjected to a heel prick test a few days after birth, which can detect sickle cell disease and many other genetic conditions. Besides childhood testing, there are two tests that can be performed to specifically detect sickle cell disease later on in someone's life. The first is a blood smear. This involves a thin layer of blood being deposited on a glass sheet and dyed so that individual cells can be easily picked out and examined. The second method is a solubility test. This method relies on the fact that the irregular sickle cell hemoglobin is much less soluble than normal hemoglobin, and therefore will not dissolve as easily in the blood plasma. It's important to note that while both of these methods do well at detecting sickle-shaped cells in an individual, they do not provide any information on an individual's genetic makeup. In other words, neither of these tests can tell you how likely you are to pass on the irregularity, or if you even fully have sickle cell disease, or just sickle cell trait. That being said, both tests are useful for diagnosing individual patients and getting them the treatment they need in a timely manner. Today, sickle cell disease remains a topic of medical and ethical debate. According to research done by the International Sickle Cell Center, sickle cell disease affects around 25 million people globally, with 60% of this 25 million being people living in sub-Saharan Africa. As I mentioned earlier, the evolutionary origins of sickle cell disease have resulted in it disproportionately affecting people of color. This becomes an issue when politics and culture come into play because while there are treatments and even cures for the disease, many of them are very expensive and therefore completely inaccessible to the people who actually need them. All that being said, there are some who are against the elimination of the sickle cell gene on the grounds that it's useful for resisting malaria, which is also extremely prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. Regardless of what either of these perspectives claim is best, neither will get what they want until the technology needed to combat either malaria or sickle cell disease becomes more accessible on a wider scale. Until then, I guess we'll keep, doing surgery on grapes or something. Alright, that's all for this week. I've been Saint Earthworm, and you can consider yourself blessed with knowledge. Ciao!